They expected me to hand over the home I spent 10 years saving for just to make my sister's wedding perfect. When I said no, my father hit me in front of 200 guests. But that was just the beginning. If you've ever stayed silent because you thought your voice didn't matter, stay with me. This is the story of how the forgotten daughter took a stand, demanded justice, and turned betrayal into power. My name is Rachel, and I'm 31 years old. By now, I've learned many truths in life, but one of the earliest and most painful was this. In my family, love always came with conditions, and I never seemed to meet them. I was 5 when my younger sister Samantha was born. She came into the world red-faced and wailing, and somehow that tiny scream seemed to echo into every corner of our home, rearranging everything. My mother Elaine, who used to brush my hair each morning and tuck me in with a lullaby, transformed overnight. She started ordering custom baby clothes from Etsy, labeling everything Princess Sam. She embroidered Samantha's name on pillows and called her our little miracle. I was asked to help. Not hold her. Not play with her, but help like a junior nanny. My father Greg once, my weekend park buddy and popsicle provider, became a cameraman for Samantha's every breath. I remember how we used to have a tradition feeding ducks at the pond every Sunday morning. The week Samantha came home, the ducks waited alone. My father never picked up the tradition again. Sam just smiled. He'd yell across the room, filming her toothless grin like it was the second coming of Christ. It wasn't that I hated my sister. I didn't. But from the moment she arrived, I learned something quietly brutal. Some people are born to be the main character, and some are cast in the background. I was the latter. When I was 6, I drew a picture in art class of a horse with bright blue wings soaring over a mountain of stars. I was so proud of it, my teacher even gave me a gold sticker. I waited until my mom had finished feeding Samantha before bringing it over. She looked at it, wrinkled her nose, and said, "A blue horse. That doesn't even make sense. Samantha's drawing sunflowers now. She has such an eye for color." I folded the paper quietly and tucked it under my bed. That drawing never made it to the fridge. The next morning, Samantha's scribbles, literally just purple zigzags, took up 3 magnets. That was the first time I remember understanding what it felt like to be invisible. It didn't happen in one big dramatic moment. It was 1,000 small things, a glance that slid past me, a birthday card that was forgotten, a ballet recital attended with cameras while my science fair sat alone. I was 7 when I realized it was easier not to speak unless spoken to. That silence caused fewer sighs. By the time I was in 3rd grade, I had glasses, rounded shoulders from hunching over books, and a growing collection of straight-A report cards, none of which were ever displayed. My mother used to tell her friends, "Rachel's bright, of course, a little rigid, though. Not like Sam. She lights up a room." The other moms would laugh politely. I laughed too. I got good at that. Laughing at things that weren't funny. When I was 10, I won 1st place in a statewide short story contest. It was the proudest moment of my life. My name was printed in a glossy program. I stood on stage in front of hundreds of people and read an excerpt while the audience clapped. My parents weren't in the auditorium. They had taken Samantha to her first ballet class. When I got home and showed them the certificate, my mother barely looked up from folding tutus. "That's nice, sweetie. But don't become one of those uptight bookworms. Go get some sun." My dad asked. Did it come with prize money? Meanwhile, when Samantha got a B+ in English, there was cake, real frosted cake with sparklers and a card that said, "You're destined for greatness." I sat quietly chewing leftover rice. It wasn't jealousy. Not exactly. It was the ache of being present but never seen. Like living in a house made of glass, you could see everything, but no one ever looked back at you. As we got older, the pattern continued. Samantha was allowed to skip chores because she was preparing for her regional choir auditions. I, on the other hand, scrubbed bathrooms, vacuumed rugs, and folded sheets. When I once complained, Mom didn't hesitate. "You're the big sister. That means sacrifice." That word sacrifice became the leash I wore for most of my childhood. I don't remember hugs from my parents. I do remember falling asleep at my desk one night from hunger, only to be shaken awake by my mother the next morning. "Stop being dramatic," she snapped. "There's still laundry left." By 15, I had stopped expecting anyone to notice my achievements. I started quietly collecting them like pressed flowers taped behind my bedroom door. Every straight-A report card, every writing prize, every math trophy, a whole wall of triumphs no one ever saw. And through it all, that drawing of the blue horse stayed hidden under my bed, a silent reminder of the first time I was told I didn't make sense. I didn't hate my family. I just stopped trusting that love from them was something I could ever earn. I stopped speaking my mind. I stopped asking for anything I wanted. One thing only: to leave, to get away, to find a world where I didn't have to shrink myself just to fit in the background. But I kept that horse. Years later, long after I'd moved out, when I opened the old manila folder that held it, edges curled crayon marks. Faded, I still saw her. That strange blue horse flying over stars, a creature that didn't make sense. And I loved her for it, because somehow, even when I couldn't speak up for myself, she'd kept flying. I left home on my 18th birthday with a second-hand suitcase, 3 pairs of jeans, and a full scholarship to study biochemistry at the University of Michigan. There was no goodbye party, no photos at the front door, no teary-eyed parents wishing me luck. Samantha was hosting a live-stream tour of her redecorated bedroom that afternoon, complete with fairy lights and a white shag rug. I remember standing at the curb watching my bus pull in as my phone buzzed with a single text from my mother. "Don't embarrass the family. And don't come running back." That was it. No good luck. No, we're proud of you. Just a warning. Like I was a scandal waiting to happen. I didn't cry. I'd already used up all my tears years ago, quietly under my blanket in the silence after dinner. The day I left, I felt something strange. Not grief, not fear. It was a dull kind of relief, like exhaling after holding your breath for too long. Ann Arbor was cold. The first snow dusted the windowsill of my dorm like powdered sugar. I watched it fall while sipping ramen and highlighting textbook lines in neon yellow. My roommate went out to frat parties and posted pictures of red cups and glittery eyeshadow. I stayed in, studied, worked part-time in the library stacking books. Cleaned beakers in the chemistry lab on weekends. I told myself it wasn't loneliness, it was strategy. It wasn't that I didn't want fun, I just didn't know how to want it for myself. Wanting had always been a dangerous thing. My mom once said biochemistry was for people who liked being alone. Maybe she meant it as an insult, but I wore it like armor because biochemistry made sense. Molecules don't lie. Reactions follow rules. You mix certain things and the outcome is predictable. Unlike love. Unlike family. By the time I graduated, I had a job offer from Everbright Biotech in Chicago. An entry-level position, but one that made me feel like I had finally stepped into my own name. Rachel Bennett, Molecular Development Associate, not Samantha's sister, not Elaine's quiet daughter. Just me. The salary wasn't glamorous, $72,000 a year before taxes, but it was more money than anyone in my family thought I'd ever make, not that they cared. I lived like I had nothing, no parties, no takeout, no designer handbags or spa days. I reused Ziploc bags, patched up socks, walked instead of Ubering, and tracked every expense on a spreadsheet labeled Freedom. Every dollar saved was a brick in the wall I was building to keep their voices out, to keep my sanity in. And then nearly a decade later, on a spring afternoon, I held the keys to my first house. It was a modest 3-bedroom in Evanston, just north of Chicago, quiet neighborhood, tree-lined streets close enough to the train, but far enough to hear birds in the morning. The list price was $445,000. I negotiated it down to $437,000, with a near 50% down payment from 10 years of relentless saving. At the closing table, when I signed the final document, my hands trembled, not from doubt, but from the weight of it all. This house wasn't just property, it was proof that I'd survived. That I'd built something with no one clapping in the audience, no safety net, no applause, just grit. I walked into the empty living room that day and sat cross-legged on the hardwood floor, no furniture, no curtains, just me, and the sound of my own breath echoing against clean white walls. I opened a manila folder from the bottom of a moving box and gently pulled out a folded piece of paper, the blue horse still flying. Still strange, still mine. I framed it, not in something expensive, just a plain black frame from the craft store, but I hung it up first, right above the fireplace. It was the first thing I wanted the room to see. The kitchen had smooth white tiles, the kind I used to admire in home magazines I couldn't afford. I bought used appliances, repainted the cabinets, and installed the knobs myself. The balcony overlooked a cherry tree that bloomed in May. I set a rocking chair there with a small side table, just enough for a book and a cup of tea. Room by room, I painted the walls with soft, hopeful colors. Warm, beige, dusty, rose, sky blue. I planted lavender in the backyard and labeled the jars in my pantry. I didn't hire anyone, I did it all myself. Slowly, carefully. Like writing a letter to the little girl who once taped certificates behind her bedroom door and hoped someone might notice. And one day, as I stood in the hallway, hammer in hand, placing a shelf above the light switch, I whispered without thinking, "Now I exist." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The walls heard it. The house heard it. And for the first time, I believed it. 3 months after I moved into my house, a text from my mother appeared on my phone for the first time in years. "Elaine Bennett, call me when you have a moment. It's important about Samantha." I stared at the message for a long time, thumb hovering over the screen. I hadn't heard a word from her since the day I left home. In fact, the last I'd heard from a cousin, my mom had been telling people I'd moved to somewhere near the Canadian border, like I'd simply evaporated. Now, suddenly, I was important because it was about Sam. I didn't call. 2 days later, a pale pink envelope arrived in my mailbox. Embossed floral trim, elegant script, an invitation. "You are cordially invited to the engagement celebration of Samantha Elaine Bennett and Ethan James. Whitmore." Tucked behind the card was a sticky note in my mother's handwriting. Flowery controlled. "Please don't be dramatic. Just be a good sister this time." I felt the familiar sting in my stomach. The implication was clear. Don't cause trouble. Don't stand out. Don't be. "Rachel?" I almost didn't go. I rehearsed saying no a dozen times. But something made me iron my one good dress, wrap a small gift, and drive to Lake Forest on a gray Saturday. The party was held at a rented mansion with marble floors and lavender-scented candles in crystal holders. Everything looked like it had been plucked from a bridal magazine. Guests glided through the space with champagne flutes in hand, talking in soft, elegant tones. Sam stood at the center, sparkling like a Disney character, beaming in a silk gown that probably cost more than my couch. I walked in quietly, wearing a simple black dress and holding a silver photo frame. Nothing extravagant, just engraved with the words, "Wishing you happiness." It felt honest, not flashy but real. I placed the gift on the table and was just turning to find a quiet corner when I felt my mother's hand on my arm. Her smile was tight like stretched plastic. "Your father wants to talk to you." In the side room, her voice was sugar, her grip was steel. The room was dim, curtained off from the rest of the event. My father stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, like a CEO giving bad news. When I walked in, he didn't turn around right away. "You've settled in now, haven't you?" he said to the glass. "I'm doing well," I replied, neutral. He nodded once, then turned. "Samantha's getting married. She deserves a solid start. And you live alone. You're not even using that house fully." I blinked. The air around me thickened. "What do you mean?" My mother stepped in then, as if on cue. Her tone was calm, like this was all perfectly reasonable. "We think this is a good opportunity for you to show love, Rachel. A chance to give back. You should transfer ownership of your house to Samantha and Ethan. Consider it a wedding gift." From a sister, I laughed. Not a real laugh, the kind that bursts out when your brain short-circuits. A gift. I said. You're asking me to give away the one thing I've worked a decade to earn. You don't have anyone, my mother said flatly. Samantha is starting a family. She needs support. The insult wasn't in the words. It was in the tone, as if being single made me less worthy of the roof over my head. I don't have anyone. I repeated slowly. So I don't deserve to keep my own home. My mother's expression hardened. Don't twist this. Rachel family is about sacrifice. I looked at her. Really looked at her. And for the first time in my adult life, I didn't shrink under her gaze. I sacrificed my entire childhood for this family I cooked, cleaned, disappeared so Sam could shine. And now you want me to give away the only thing I've ever had for myself? I said, voice growing colder. No. Not this time. My father's jaw clenched. You're being selfish. No, I said. I'm being seen. For the first time in 30 years, the silence between us was electric, a war zone with no bombs, only truths long buried. I'm not transferring anything, I finished, and if you ever respected me even a little, you'd understand why I walked out. Back in the reception hall, the music was still playing. Sam was laughing with her guests, glowing under string lights. But when our eyes met, her smile flickered for just a second, like she'd sensed the script wasn't going to plan. I didn't stay for dessert. I didn't need another toast to someone else's bright future. As I walked toward the exit, my phone buzzed. Sam, are you seriously going to ruin this for me? Be better. Rachel. I didn't reply, but I knew one thing as I stepped into the night: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I wasn't planning to attend the wedding. After the engagement party ambush, after the absurd request to surrender my house, I'd made peace with being absent. But then came the texts. The passive-aggressive guilt trips, the subtle threats. People will notice if you're not there. Don't make Samantha look like an only child. So I showed up. Not to support. Not to celebrate. Just to witness quietly and leave without fanfare. The venue was a glass conservatory in Highland Park, arched ceilings strung with fairy lights, cream velvet chairs and white roses in gold-trimmed vases. Guests sipped champagne and complimented Samantha's designer gown. It was flawless. The whole scene was flawless. Except for one thing. Me. I arrived on time and alone, wearing the same black dress from the engagement party. I checked the seating chart. My name was scribbled at a corner table near the exit alongside distant relatives and someone labeled +1. TBD. No one greeted me. No one noticed. Except my mother. From across the room, Elaine's eyes locked on me with that same plastic smile stretched too tight. Moments later, she approached. Your father would like to speak with you, she said. Her voice dipped in civility, but laced with ice. Just for a moment. In the cake area, part of me wanted to say no, to walk away and let their manipulation sit in the silence it deserved. But another part, the conditioned part, still responded to requests like commands. Still hoped, maybe irrationally, that this time would be different. I followed her. The space was roped off, curtained in sheer white panels. A 3-tier cake towered nearby, adorned with edible pearls and ivory roses. Beside it sat a heavy metal base engraved with Samantha and Ethan in cursive. Greg stood beside it, back straight. Hands folded. Rachel. He began softly. You still have a chance to make this right. Don't ruin your sister's big day. I stayed still. Calm, focused. If this is about the house, save your breath. My mother appeared behind me like a specter. We asked for something simple, she said sharply. You act like we're stealing from you. I turned to them both. That house is mine. I worked for 10 years, 10 years of skipped dinners, worn shoes, second-hand furniture to earn it. I never asked you for anything. Not even love. Elaine stepped forward, her voice rising. Family makes sacrifices. I sacrificed my childhood, I snapped. Don't ask me to give away my adulthood, too. That's when Greg moved. Quick, abrupt. He reached behind him, grabbed the metal cake base, and swung. All I saw was silver, then impact. A blinding pain exploded across my temple. I stumbled backward, fell. My head hit the edge of the table before I crumpled to the polished floor. Blood. I felt it first. Warm, wet, and fast. It streamed down my face, soaking the front of my dress. For a moment, everything blurred. The music from the reception still played faintly in the distance. Then I heard it. The gasp, the scream, the chaos. "She's bleeding. Someone call 911. Phones were out. Guests crowded toward the curtain. Someone pulled it open. Ethan pushed through the crowd, eyes wide in horror. "What the hell did you do?" he yelled, rushing toward me. My father stepped back as if waking from a trance. She provoked. "You hit her." Ethan roared. "You hit your daughter." A man in a gray suit pulled out his phone. I vaguely recognized him. Daniel, one of Ethan's colleagues. "I'm calling the police," he said loudly. "I just witnessed an assault." My mother stood frozen, not with fear, but with fury. "She's doing this to destroy Samantha's wedding." She's always been bitter. I tried to speak, but my vision swam. Ethan knelt beside me, pressing a napkin to the gash on my head. His hands were shaking. "You're going to be okay. Help is coming." The sirens arrived minutes later. The police walked in fast, serious. "Greg Bennett?" one officer asked. Greg nodded slowly, blood still on his hands. "You're under arrest for aggravated assault." My mother lunged forward. "You can't do this. She's lying." Another officer held up a phone. "We have video. Multiple angles." Elaine's face drained of color. The handcuffs clicked into place. Guests fell silent, cameras lowered. The couple who had been adored as dignified hosts hours earlier were now being walked out like criminals. Because they were, I was treated at the scene before the ambulance arrived. Ethan climbed in beside me without hesitation. He held my hand, his thumb rubbing small circles into my palm. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "No one should ever go through that. Not on their sister's wedding day. Not ever." I didn't answer. I didn't have to. The silence said enough. At the venue, everything unraveled. Margaret and Dean. Whitmore. Ethan's parents stood stiffly by the exit, expressions carved in stone. "That man used violence," Margaret said coldly, "at his daughter's wedding." Dean turned to his son. "Are you sure this is the family you want to tie yourself to?" Samantha ran toward them, eyes wet. "I didn't know they'd do that. I didn't do anything." "You let it happen," Margaret replied. Dean stepped forward. "We can't marry into this." Ethan said nothing. Then quietly he walked past. Samantha took his parents by the arm and left. No ring, no vows, no forgiveness, just a clean exit from a day that was supposed to be perfect. Samantha collapsed into a chair alone in a ballroom full of strangers. Her wedding was over, not with a kiss, but with a crime scene. The hospital ceiling was a dull cream cracked slightly in one corner. I stared at it for hours, listening to the steady beep of the monitor next to me. The bandage on my head was thick. 8 stitches, a mild concussion and bruising that throbbed behind my eyes like a drum. But none of that compared to what I felt inside. It wasn't just pain. It was disbelief. Disbelief that my father had swung a metal cake stand at my head, that my mother stood there and called me selfish as I bled on the floor, that my sister said nothing, did nothing. The first night, Ethan sat beside me and didn't speak. He just held my hand and passed me ice chips. On the second night, he brought a bag of my clothes from home and a bouquet of purple dahlias, my favorite. "I thought you might want something real near you," he said quietly. On the third, he showed up with a man in his early 40s, sharp navy suit, dark briefcase, calm voice. "This is Marcus Whitmore," Ethan said. "He's one of the best family law attorneys in the city." And a friend, Marcus didn't waste time, Miss Bennett. I've read the police report, reviewed some of the footage, and spoken to 2 of the witnesses I'd like to formally offer to represent you if you choose to move forward legally. I didn't respond. My head ached, but it wasn't the concussion. It was the weight of the decision pressing down on my spine. Just think about it, Marcus said, leaving his card on the tray beside my water cup. That night, alone in the hospital room, I opened my phone for the first time in days. There was a message from Samantha. Samantha, I can't believe you let it get this far. You embarrassed us in front of 200 people. You could have walked away quietly, but you had to make it a scene. I'm heartbroken, Rachel. You ruined everything. I read it 3 times. Not a single sentence about the fact that I'd been assaulted. Not one word of concern, only blame, only shame. And somehow, I still felt guilty. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the blinds, landing in slants across the white hospital sheets. Ethan brought coffee and a small folder. I didn't want to push, he said gently, but you need to know. Marcus is ready if you are. I looked at the folder. I didn't touch it. Later that afternoon, after Ethan had left for a meeting, I sat alone with that folder in my lap, my fingers brushed across the edge, hesitant. I thought about everything that would come next if I opened it. Courtrooms, testimonies, accusations, public attention, a daughter suing her parents. And then I looked across the room at my bag. The top was slightly unzipped, and through the gap I saw it. The corner of the old blue horse drawing, tucked in the side pocket, a piece of a life I'd tried to protect, tried to forget, tried to outgrow. I pulled it out. The colors were faded now, 10 years of moves and dust and quiet keeping, but the shape was still there, blue wings, galloping hooves, the impossible against the sky. I held it in my hands, staring. And I whispered more to myself than to anything else, maybe this time I ride. That evening, I called Marcus. I'm ready. 2 days later, he returned to the hospital with documents and a game plan. 3 primary charges: aggravated assault, prolonged emotional abuse, and attempted coercion of property. He'd already begun collecting evidence, medical records confirming the head trauma, video footage from 6 different angles, witness statements from Ethan Daniel, 2 guests, and even the venue manager, a printed copy of Samantha's message. We'll argue not just the physical harm, but the pattern of manipulation and psychological neglect that spans decades, Marcus explained. I never thought I'd be here. I admitted. No one ever does, he said. But justice isn't about comfort. It's about clarity. I signed the authorization forms with hands that trembled, but didn't stop. The last page had a line I kept rereading. Plaintiff Rachel Bennett, defendants. Greg Bennett and Elaine Bennett, filed in Lake County District Court. I folded the papers carefully and slid them back into the folder. For the first time in my life, my name had power next to theirs. Not as their daughter, not as a disappointment, but as a voice they couldn't silence anymore. That night, I slept without dreams. When I woke the next morning, Ethan was sitting in the chair by the window reading quietly. He looked up and smiled when he saw me awake. "It's done?" he asked. I nodded. "It's started." He walked over, placed his hand on mine, and said, "No matter what happens next. Rachel, you already did the bravest thing anyone can do. You stopped the cycle." I didn't answer. I just looked down at the drawing in my lap, that strange flying blue horse, and for the first time, I didn't feel like it was a secret. I felt like it was a beginning. The courtroom smelled faintly of wood polish and nerves. A packed gallery lined the benches, most of them strangers, some journalists, some curious locals who'd read the headlines. Daughter sues parents after wedding assault. Family secrets unravel. My name had traveled further than I ever imagined. This wasn't just a lawsuit. It was a spotlight on years of silence I never meant to share. I sat at the front with Marcus to my right and Ethan just behind me, always in reach, but never overstepping. He had been the only constant since the incident, steady as the rhythm of my breath. Across the aisle, Greg and Elaine sat flanked by their attorney, all steel postures and cold eyes. My mother wore a beige blazer and pearls as if she thought looking respectable would rewrite history. My father's jaw was clenched like a man who thought control was still within his grasp. But in this room, control didn't belong to them. It belonged to the truth. The bailiff called the courtroom to order, and Judge Sylvia Martinez, graying hair tied in a low bun, voice like flint, entered with a gaze sharp enough to silence the air. Marcus began, Your Honor. Members of the jury, what you will hear over the next few days is not merely the account of a single incident. This is the final blow in a pattern of emotional abandonment, manipulation, and coercion that spanned over 30 years. This isn't just assault. It's the cost of being invisible for too long. He moved like a conductor, precise measured. He presented the medical report first, 8 stitches, concussion diagnosis, timeline of treatment. Then came the footage, 6 different angles from guests' phones synced to show every moment. The swing, the fall, the blood, the silence from Elaine, the panic from the crowd. The audio was crisp. You could hear my mother's voice shout, She's doing this to ruin Samantha's day. A gasp echoed through the gallery. Marcus didn't flinch. As you can see, there was no provocation, only a refusal of a demand. That her house, the plaintiff's legally owned home, be signed over to the defendant's favored daughter. He called witnesses. Daniel, the colleague from the reception, recounted the exact moment he saw Greg swing the base. It wasn't a loss of temper. It was precise, targeted cold. Then came the venue manager, a quiet woman named April, who confirmed the couple had tried to block paramedics from entering the side room, at first claiming it was a misunderstanding. The doctor from the ER testified about the head wound. A former neighbor took the stand and shared what she'd seen over years. Rachel was always in the background, always the helper. I used to wonder why no one ever came to her science fairs. Then I was called. I stood, walked to the stand, and looked out at the jury. 9 faces, most middle-aged, all watching me, not like I was a spectacle, but like they truly wanted to hear. So I told them about the blue horse, about the hidden report cards, about the feeling of eating cold rice while cake was served for a B+. I told them what it felt like to grow up as a ghost in your own family, to know that being good only earned you more invisibility. I didn't cry. I had cried enough for a lifetime already. What I had left wasn't grief. It was clarity. Their lawyer tried to paint it as a misunderstanding fueled by family tension, that Greg had lost control in a highly emotional moment. But no one bought it. You don't lose control with that kind of aim. You don't yell selfish over your own daughter's blood if you're in shock. Marcus stood for final remarks. This isn't just about the object that struck Rachel's head. It's about a pattern, a family culture where Rachel's voice was silenced for decades. And when she finally used it, they tried to punish her for daring to be visible. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, the air felt electric. The foreperson, a woman in her late 50s with silver hair and steel-gray eyes, stood. We, the jury, find the defendants Greg Bennett and Elaine Bennett guilty on all counts: aggravated assault, prolonged emotional abuse, and attempted coercion of property. A hush fell over the courtroom. I sat still. I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't overwhelmed, but because I had run out of sorrow years ago. What filled me now wasn't sadness. It was relief. It was release. Judge Martinez's voice rang clear. Based on the evidence presented and the severity of the actions, this court sentences Greg and Elaine Bennett to 8 years in state custody with no eligibility for parole for 6. Additionally, they are ordered to pay $320,000 in damages covering medical expenses, legal fees, and emotional restitution to Rachel Bennett. There was a pause. One heartbeat of stillness. Then the bailiff approached my parents. The clink of handcuffs echoed through the courtroom like punctuation. Elaine turned to look at me one last time. Her eyes held no regret, only blame. I met her gaze and then I looked away. She was no longer the judge of my worth, no longer the gatekeeper of my silence. Outside the courthouse, light rain began to fall. Ethan opened an umbrella and held it over both of us. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of being seen, because this time I had spoken, and the world had listened. The rain had stopped by the time we stepped outside the courthouse. The clouds had begun to pull apart, letting slices of afternoon sunlight fall across the stone steps. I felt the weight of the past hours slowly lift, not gone, not forgotten, but no longer pressing down on my spine. Ethan stood beside me, still holding the umbrella, though the sky no longer required it. He looked at me with something quiet and steady in his eyes, not pity, not pride, something simpler. Belief. "Rachel," he said softly, pulling something from his jacket pocket, a small velvet box. No kneeling, no crowd, no dramatic flourish. Just him. Me. The courthouse steps where I had finally spoken my truth and watched justice walk out in handcuffs. He opened the box. Inside was a ring. Simple. A silver band with a small opal that caught the sunlight like a secret smile. "I know this isn't a perfect moment," he said, "but life's never been perfect for you. It's been survival. It's been silence. And you made it through all of it. I'm not here to fix anything. I just want to walk with you forward." He paused. "You don't need to earn love, Rachel. You deserve it, just by being you." My throat tightened, and for the first time in a long time, my tears returned, not from pain or grief, but from something so unfamiliar, it almost scared me. "Joy," I nodded. "Yes," I whispered. "We didn't plan a grand wedding. There were no castles, no choreographed first dances, no seating charts with gold calligraphy. Just a backyard, our backyard. 30 guests, friends who had shown up when it counted, colleagues from Everbright, Daniel and his wife. The venue manager who testified. A neighbor who once brought me soup while I recovered. We placed white chairs along the garden path where lavender bloomed in the sunlight. Mason jars filled with wild daisies lined the aisle. A small speaker played acoustic guitar covers. The cake was homemade, lemon and raspberry with slightly uneven frosting. I baked it with Ethan the night before, laughing when the layers slanted just a little. And at the front, under an arch of ivy, stood Marcus, in a tailored gray suit, eyes warmer than I'd ever seen in court. He looked not like a lawyer that day, but like a witness. A symbol, proof that justice could be gentle too. He cleared his throat before he spoke. "I've stood in many rooms beside Rachel Bennett. A deposition room, a courtroom, a hospital corridor. But today is my favorite room, because it's one she built not to defend herself, but to begin." People smiled. Some teared up. Then Ethan and I exchanged vows, not scripted, not borrowed. Just ours. "I won't promise to make you laugh every day," he said, voice low and firm. "But I promise you'll never cry alone again." I couldn't speak, so I placed my hand on his heart, an answer without words, and he understood. After the ceremony, we all ate beneath the string lights. Ethan had hung himself wobbly and low in places, but beautiful anyway. The food was simple: grilled vegetables, salad, wine from a local vineyard. The night air was warm, sweet with the scent of rosemary from the herb bed near the porch. No one filmed it, no one live-streamed, and no one cared about my dress, which I'd found in a thrift shop for $60. They only cared that I smiled, really smiled. Inside the house, just above the small wooden shelf where we'd placed candles and photos of the day, hung the blue horse I'd framed it in glass. This time, the drawing that once lived in darkness, stuffed under a childhood bed, now took its place at the center of our home. People asked about it. I told them, "It's the part of me that kept going even when I didn't know how." They didn't need more explanation. They just nodded the way people do when they feel something, even if they can't name it. Later that night, Ethan carried me over the threshold, not because we had to, but because he insisted. "My back can take it," he said, grinning. I laughed and let him. because for once it felt okay to be held. We danced in the living room with no music, just the creak of old floorboards and the faint hum of the fridge. And when the lights were out and the guests were gone and the house was silent again, I stood for a moment in front of the blue horse, running a finger along the edge of the frame. "You made it," I whispered. But I wasn't talking to the paper. I was talking to myself. The first time someone called me a survivor, I flinched. It was during an interview with a local journalist covering the verdict. She had asked how I wanted to be remembered. "A survivor," she offered. I didn't answer at first because I wasn't sure that word was enough. I had survived, yes. But surviving implies endurance alone. And what I had done, what I was still doing, felt like something more. It wasn't just about making it through. It was about becoming. A month after the trial, Marcus and I sat at the kitchen table over mugs of lukewarm coffee and stacks of papers. "This is bigger than you. You know," he said, tapping a sheet of email printouts. He was right. Since the verdict, messages had poured in: emails, letters, handwritten notes slipped under the door of my now publicly listed nonprofit address. Women from 30 states and even a few from Canada and the UK. Most began the same way I thought I was the only one. Some had been disowned. Others manipulated out of inheritances. Some endured years of verbal abuse behind closed doors masked by Sunday smiles and Christmas cards. Many had never spoken their truth aloud until they watched mine unfold in court. One letter came from a girl still in high school. I saw the video. "You looked brave. I want to be brave too." Another from a retired nurse in her 70s. "I still live with the voice of my mother in my head. But watching you gave me the courage to finally speak back." Each story chipped away at something I didn't know. I still carried the belief that I had been alone. And so we built Restore. It started in a single room above a community library. No funding, no board, just a sign printed at a FedEx office and a stack of intake forms. But it grew because people came. We provided legal consultations, therapy referrals, and most importantly, space, a place where people could be believed and begin again. Ethan handled the finances, helped us apply for grants and nonprofit status. Marcus trained our first volunteer team, and I sat in folding chairs across from trembling hands and tear-streaked faces and listened. Really listened, because I knew what it felt like to finally be heard. One afternoon during walk-in hours, a woman in her 50s stepped through the door. Her name was Nancy. She wore a beige coat and carried a canvas tote that looked older than most of our furniture. She sat across from me quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I've lived 52 years trying to be someone my family could tolerate. I married who they told me to. Stayed in a job I hated. I still ask permission to buy things for myself. I waited. I watched your trial. I watched your face when the verdict came in. And I knew if you could speak, I could too." Her voice cracked. "I packed a suitcase that night and I left." She reached across the table and took my hand. "You gave me permission to live." I held her fingers in mine, the way Ethan had once held mine in the hospital. Small circles. No words needed. We were the same, Nancy and I. Different ages, different stories, but the same ache, the same courage. People started calling, "Restore a movement." We didn't plan for that. We didn't seek attention. But when something is real, when people are desperate for truth, it spreads. We hosted support circles every Thursday evening, not always full, but always honest. Some weeks there were only 3 of us, some weeks 20. A man came once shaking as he admitted his mother had destroyed his credit in college. A young woman told us about years of gaslighting from an older sister. A teacher brought her teenage niece who had just fled a coercive home. No two stories were the same, but the silence that came before them, that was always familiar. The house, my house, remained at the heart of it all. On weekends, we opened the backyard for garden therapy, lavender, rosemary, wild mint. We built a bench under the cherry tree and called it the Bench of Beginnings. Inside, I created a space just above the fireplace, a wooden frame, a plaque that read, "This is not where the story ends. This is where you begin again." And just below it hung the blue horse, framed in glass, light catching its faded crayon wings, still flying, still strange, still mine. Sometimes I walk through the Restore office after hours when the lights are dim and the rooms are empty. I think about the girl I used to be, the one who taped report cards behind her bedroom door, waiting for someone to say she mattered. She's still here, but she's no longer waiting. She's working. She's building. She's guiding others to their own exits. I didn't just survive, I lit my own way out. And now I hand the torch to anyone else still walking through the dark. Because healing isn't just possible, it's contagious.